This video is for Module 39 on the differences in growth rates between countries. So if you have been keeping up in your reading your textbook, Module 38 talked about different areas of the world, for example, East Asia versus Africa versus Latin America, and why some areas of the world are growing more rapidly than others. Specifically, for example, East Asia has a lot of countries that have very high growth rates, whereas African countries have a lot of very low growth rates. So essentially what this is looking at is why is that? What are some of the indicators and factors that lead to different countries have higher growth rates than others? Well, it basically all boils back down to what the government can do to be able to make a difference in promoting growth. So remember from some of the previous videos is that there are three main things, three categories that will lead to long-run economic growth. And those are growth in physical capital, human capital, and technology. So the government can do a bunch of things to be able to encourage all three of those. So first of all, physical capital can be encouraged from the government by having some organizational, health, and finance infrastructure. Organizational infrastructure, we're referring to the things like bridges and roads and internet connections and bandwidth and water and sewer and electricity, those kinds of things. And so having that in place will definitely increase the possibility of being able to increase your physical capital. Think about something as simple as roads, okay? So if you have roads and bridges that are out of date, not only are you going to have obviously things like potholes, and so then you're going to have to drive slower, but you're also going to have you also may have roads that, for example, are too small for the amount of traffic to drive on it. Maybe it's only a 2-lane road, it needs to be at least a 4-lane road. Those things are going to definitely affect the transportation of products to factories to be able to actually make physical capital. Health infrastructure, things like providing public health to people, making sure people are vaccinated, getting yearly health checkups and screenings. Those things are going to be encouraging physical capital, because if you have a healthy population, then obviously they're going to be much more likely to be more productive workers. So that will help with increasing physical capital. And then lastly, this finance infrastructure, a banking system. So a healthy banking system where you have banks that can make loans out to people, but they're not necessarily making crazy amounts of loans to people that are not going to pay it back. They are going to be making loans that make sense, and they will charge a fair interest rate, and so therefore businesses can be able to get the money they need to be able to create more physical capital. So all three of these are things that the government can do to make sure that we have a growth in physical capital. Human capital is encouraged through just spending on education. Remember, human capital is just that education and training. That makes a difference as far as the importance that different country places on education. And some of it has to do with cultural differences. Some cultures place a higher emphasis on education than others. I found this graphic to be quite interesting. This was looking at the countries that have a largest percentage of their total public expenditure, so their total public spending, how much of it is spent on education. The interesting thing is that New Zealand is leading the charge, with Mexico right behind. Two countries that you may not necessarily associate with high quality education. However, keep in mind, just because they spend a lot of money doesn't necessarily mean that they're going to be having quality. Because keep in mind that, you could throw a whole bunch of money on it. It's just a question of what are you using that money for. So those are things to increase physical and human capital. What about technology? Well, technology is encouraged through government funding and research and development. R&D is important in the private sector as well as the public sector. The government has private think tanks, or their public think tanks that are constantly doing research for the government. But they also are encouraging private industry. So, for example, they may have private companies that, for example, maybe they're researching let's say that they're researching a solution to type 1 diabetes. The government would encourage that by giving some sort of subsidy to those kinds of companies. Okay, so that's one way that they can encourage it. Now, that's physical capital, human capital, and technology, but there are some other things that do affect growth rates. Other things that can promote growth: political stability, making sure that we don't have, riots in the streets, and we don't have, constant upheaval because there has been a change in leadership of a particular country. This particular picture is of a demonstration in Thailand, or in Nepal, and so they were obviously not agreeing with whatever the government was doing at the time. Also ensuring private property rights, because if you're constantly going and having an idea that either another private citizen or the government is taking from you, or in this case, as my picture illustrates, your house, it doesn't really encourage a whole lot of growth. People don't want to go and get involved because it's just going to be taken away from me anyways. So, for example, in the United States, we try and protect private property rights, for example, intellectual property, through things like patents. You can patent your ideas, so nobody else takes it. But at the same point in time, you also don't want to have an excessive involvement in the economy. So all of these things that, kind of goes against what I've been saying is that all of these things are, you have to have some sort of balance. You don't want to have the government constantly meddling in things, because then what happens is that stifles growth. Because if the government's constantly involved in pushing for, that you have to pay more taxes or follow more regulations, that doesn't encourage growth either. So there has to be some sort of balance. So these are the ways that the government can go and promote growth. Now, overall, is growth sustainable? Over time, can growth continue over time, continuously? Well, some people make the argument that we have a limited amount of resources out there in the world. What about, our natural resources, things like oil? We're running out of oil. Well, a lot of economists will say yes, there are limited resources, but what happens is that as we run out of those resources, naturally, because of supply and demand, it's naturally going to cause a left shift in supply, and so as a result, naturally, these products are going to cost more. So, for example, the price of oil has gone up. If the price of oil goes up, then what happens is that people look for alternative options, because they realize that, okay, this is too expensive for them. A good example of this in the last a few years ago, when the price of oil was ridiculously high, and so it caused the price of gas to be, over $4 a gallon. So what happened? Well, we had a lot more smart cars. We had a lot more fuel-efficient cars even. And so they were trying to find alternative energies. There was a growth in wind turbines and wind energy and solar energy. But all of these illustrate that, over time, because the price is going up, we'll find alternatives. We will figure it out, and there'll be more of an incentive to do that. So, renewable versus non-renewable energy. So this is looking at all of our non-renewable energy, fossil fuels, coal, natural gas, nuclear, versus hydropower, solar energy, geothermal, wind, all of those things that are renewable. So when these start to run out and the price of these goes up, we're going to be much more likely, and we're going to be much more incentivized to look into those renewable energies. So what about the environment? Is the environment at odds with economic growth? Is it an either-or thing? If I want economic growth, am I going to have to sacrifice things that are negatively impacting the environment? Or vice versa, if I want to save the planet and I want to be environmentally friendly, am I going to have to give up economic growth? Well, that is for debate. This particular cartoon is looking at this couple is watching television and it shows, look, economic growth's going up, but outside you have like global warming out there. What needs to be done to make sure that these two goals are not at odds? Lowering your environmental impact and your environmental footprint, as well as increasing economic growth. I do have a video clip here. I will post this on Canvas right below because it's like 8 minutes long, but it is looking at China specifically, because China has the largest economic growth rate currently. However, they are also the largest emitter of fossil fuels. And so, you know, they're using fossil fuels, and they're having this problem that they're contributing to the environmental impact problem. So what needs to be done? So I encourage you to take a look at that video, because it does make some good suggestions about what the government particularly can do to encourage that. So keep in mind that we want to have low carbon growth. We need to be efficient with the resources we have, but we also need to have an inclusivity of everybody buying into it, because if we don't buy into it, it's not going to happen. So that's kind of it for Module 39. Let me know if you have any questions.